I think we're going to see a retracement here, but it could be very short term, could be extended, but it is not the end of gold going up. I believe that by the end of the year, gold will breach 2,088 and trade as high as 2,100.
Gold has moved up because of underlying inflationary fundamentals. It's already been trending up anyway, even prior to the war in Ukraine. We did see a geopolitical risk premium being added to gold, hence why we saw $2,000 an ounce. So I'm just going to ask you to put on your geopolitics hat here and just speculate as to how this war could resolve itself, if indeed we do see either a military and or diplomatic resolution in sight in the near future, because that, as you mentioned before, does impact the gold market. How do you see the war playing out? How do you see gold reacting?
For the crisis in Ukraine to end, one of two things has to happen. Either the Ukrainian government surrenders, so to speak, or comes to a compromise and makes a pledge that they don't want to join NATO. They've put in their application for the European Union, but they are not in NATO, which is why there's no troops on the ground from any NATO country. But the real truth of the matter is that as Putin was putting troops on the border of Ukraine for the weeks before, and you backed this up with a poll that showed that the vast majority, including myself, could not conceive that Putin would actually invade Ukraine. It was unthinkable. What does he want to do with it? I mean, it did not make sense. When the invasion initially took place, it came when Putin announced that two areas in the eastern part of Ukraine, which is where the pro-Russian separatists reside, are now independent countries. At that point, most analysts, including myself, really believed that he's going to stop at that point. He really accomplished what he wanted to, and that was to take back that territory, kind of like what he did with Crimea. When he went in and actually invaded Ukraine itself, yes, and called it a special operation, and peacekeeping troops were sent in, they started to destroy the city, but it didn't escalate until the military of Ukraine really stepped up and made it a very, very difficult task. Putin thought he'd go in and Ukraine would roll over within days, and they had two goals, and they're odd goals, but one was demilitarization of Ukraine, get rid of their military, and the second one was, I think it's called denazification. In other words, he was saying that the right-wing government has to be removed. When the real truth is, he invaded Ukraine, in my opinion, because he wants to get rid of the current administration and replace it with a much more pro-Russian president and underlying political structure. That's why he went in. When he wasn't successful after the first 2 or 3 days, that's when the cruise missiles started going. That's when he started hitting civilian targets. And that was a huge escalation. That caused a huge move in gold, because that's no longer a controlled kind of skirmish. It's a full invasion into a sovereign country. The first time that that has occurred, as a European country has invaded another sovereign European country since World War II. It was simply unheard of, and very few people believed that that was Putin's intention. It turns out we all got it wrong. He planned to really go in there and invade and throw the government out. And I think that that's why the current president of Ukraine is realizing that there's no way they can win this long term. And as civilians continue to get, more civilians continue to get hurt, he realized that for the sake of the destruction and loss of lives, that he has to come to a compromise. He was kind of forced to the table, so to speak.
Yeah, it is a tragic scenario, what's going on over there. You did mention earlier in the interview that, you likened this war to a U.S. invasion of the Bahamas, in the sense that the power disparity between these two nations is astronomical. Are you surprised then that the Russian forces are meeting such strong conventional resistance from the Ukrainian forces? In other words, the Russians are not enjoying the type of success through conventional military means as Putin might have wanted?
I'll tell you something. It was a very, very cheerful surprise. The Ukrainians banded together, civilians and the military, all carrying weapons, and actually did stop the Russian invasion, at least slow it down. They shot down planes, they exploded armored vehicles, they killed Russian troops. It wasn't expected that they would mount the kind of unified defense of their country. At the same time, the sanctions levied by the democratic free world, they haven't really affected Putin, for instance, but they have definitely, one, isolated him from all of the other countries except maybe China and North Korea, and two, have created extreme hardship for the citizens of Russia. And so that's why we're seeing Russians protest against the war and then get arrested. I mean, I'm willing to have a peaceful protest and I'm willing to march, but I don't know that I'd be willing to get thrown in jail for 3 years or 4 years, which is what is happening in Russia. We had protests around the world, and the fact that there were Russians willing to risk their liberty, so to speak, to speak their mind that what Putin was doing was wrong is really historical, because typically Russia and Putin do not let any other viewpoint come out besides his.
And just to follow up on the poll you mentioned earlier, I did run another poll recently on my Twitter page asking followers what they think is the most likely outcome of this war. And I listed 4 possible scenarios. Number 1, Putin withdraws. Number 2, Ukraine gets a puppet government, which is more or less in line with what you had predicted. Number 3, Putin gets ousted by a military coup within Russia. Number 4, NATO intervenes, World War III erupts, and the situation really escalates out of control. Of those 4 options, number 2 was the most likely. Ukraine gets another government. People don't think that Putin is going to withdraw with his tail tucked between his legs, and the 3rd and 4th options, military coup and World War III, were equally unlikely, according to this poll. So, all right, given that people were more or less in agreement with you, the consensus view was in agreement with you, Gary, where do you see the gold price headed by the end of the year? Well, we'll give a medium-term outlook and a long-term outlook, given everything else we discussed.
Okay, if the talks yield a real solution, and it came with the fact that Ukraine was willing to compromise, because my belief is Putin was going to stay the course. The longer it took, the more aggressive he would get and the more damage he would do to Ukraine. He'd pummel the entire country. Now, what I think in terms of a long-term prognosis is if, in fact, there is a truce or peace, we could see gold retrace. We could see it go to, say, 1952, which is a 38.2% Fibonacci retracement of this leg of the rally. A 61% retracement would take us to about 1876. I think that's less likely. And from that point, I think that the inflationary pressures, because they're not going to be resolved overnight, they're going to continue to remain persistent. That's going to, at some point, support gold and let it go back into rally mode. I think we're going to see a retracement here, but it could be very short term, could be extended, but it is not the end of gold going up. I believe that by the end of the year, gold will breach 2,088 and trade as high as 2,100.